Good evening from our headquarters in Kiev. This is This Sunday show on Hromadske International, the only prime-time TV program explaining Eastern European geopolitical storm in English, and I'm Natalia Humenyuk. That's what we have prepared for you tonight. Anti-government protests sweep Armenia. Hromadske reports from Yerevan. US wants to help Ukraine, but does Ukraine want to help Ukraine? We speak to a former US ambassador to Ukraine, John Herbst. What are new challenges for civil society at the time of the conflict? We're looking at the Balkan experience. We travel to a historic park in the Donbas split by the contact line. More than 200 people arrested, including the MPs who are actively involved in the protest despite their immunity. That's all what's going on in Armenia. At least 10 people are in the hospitals with moderate injuries after the attempt to crack down the protest. So today marks the 10th of the large-scale anti-governmental protests across the whole Armenia. Tens of thousands of demonstrators chant various slogans like "Take a step against Serzh." At last week, Serzh Sargsyan, former president of Armenia, who had been running a country for 10 years, was appointed Prime Minister by the country's parliament. According to the new law initiated by Sargsyan himself, the majority of power is now in the hands of the Prime Minister, leaving the presidency as more of a ceremonial role. The protesters' four key demands are the dismissal of Prime Minister Serzh Sargsyan, an appointment of a new People's MP in his place, a formation of new interim government and snap election. Yet today's negotiations failed. Our journalist Ostap Yarysh is currently in Armenia. He is joining us via Skype from the streets of Yerevan. So, Ostap, we're very glad to hear you just explain the latest. What's going on?
Hello, Natalia. Actually, now there is happening the great gathering on the main square, the Square of Republic, in the center of Yerevan. It's maybe like 500 meters from here. Running before 40,000 people just gathered today, as it was yesterday. You know, like before these days, the mood was really, I would say, like fun and really positive. Today, people are really angry after Nikol Pashinyan, the leader of protest, was detained by police, as you mentioned. So today we could observe like the big rallies across the city. The very important thing is that they use so-called network protesting. As they say, the protests are located in different spots of Yerevan, not only in the city center. So people today were really angry. Now they're in the at the main square. What will be next? It's really hard to say, but we will see. I can say that the mood is really hitting, and the degree of protest is really hitting from day to day.
How would you describe the, attitude of the police and the law enforcement to the protesters? We know these are the peaceful protests, though we all the time hear about the numbers of people being detained every single day. So for how long are people detained? What's happening to them? And what is this action between the police and protesters?
Actually, most of them are detained for not more than 3 hours, maybe like 4 hours. Then police let them go. But like there are some cases when they try to make them sign that they violated the administration law. In this case, the protesters have to pay around like $100 fee. Yeah, as you mentioned, like every day there are around like 200 protesters detained. Many of them are pupils and students, young people. Some of them are even under 18 years old, and they really do not know their rights. That's why sometimes police manipulate. They say that if you will not sign this document that you violated the administration law, your parents will be fired, or you will have problems in your university. So for such cases, there's a big network of lawyers, of human rights activists. They visit like police stations and try to help these detained activists. But like the other thing is also interesting. Not all the police actually is violent or brutal towards activists. I could also see some policemen that were smiling or waving hands to protesters. So there are also among some of them moods that they support these protesters, but they could not join them because of their position.
And
so different attitudes.
When you talk to the protesters, of different ages, what we know, this is a coalition of different kind of people. What they were complaining, it's not just about the fact that Sargsyan will stay in power for a while. What are essence of their complaints and grievance which made them come to the streets?
Yeah, of course, there are some deeper issues. Many of them are dissatisfied with the political and economical situation in the country. Many of them mentioned the problem of corruption in the country, struggling and had really huge problems. They are really, they really want some changes in political attitude. And one interesting thing as well, when you talk to young people, most of them are skeptical and really critical to Russia. They say that this government and Sargsyan.
And Ostap, my final, we know that in a couple of days there would be the big commemoration. Just let us... Ostap, there is a poor quality, so I ask the last question. So we know that in a couple of days there would be the big commemoration of the Armenian genocide. But besides that, for how long people are going to stay on the streets? Today's Sunday, and usual rally day. So are people staying in the streets for tomorrow, a day after tomorrow? Give us a bit of an understanding where the protests are heading.
Of course, the protests do not end. People say that they are going to stay till the end. You mentioned about this genocide day, commemoration day. Actually, it's expected to be the really key day for the protesters, because usually there are huge demonstrations on this day, but also some governmental events and some these things. It's expected that government will use force to end these demonstrations. So we can expect that the situation will escalate tomorrow and the day after tomorrow. Protests, they do not end, and they will continue for next days. I do not know for how long, but people are really, let's say, they really want to be on the streets, and they do not want to stop.
Okay, thanks a lot, Ostap Yarysh. We wish you good luck with your work. So that was our own correspondent, Ostap Yarysh, who is currently walking in the streets of Yerevan, and we'll go to more analytical part of our discussion. I'll be back, we'll be back in some time. Now in Kiev by Grigor Yeritsyan, the executive director of the NGO Armenian Progressive Youth, and Nvard Margaryan, the president of the Public Information Need of Knowledge organization. And they will tell us more about the situation in Armenia, as they have this very short visit in Kiev. But before, we would watch also the report which our Hromadske correspondent had filmed and can provide us with the understanding and a feeling of what's going on in the streets of Yerevan.
6:30 in Yerevan, it means that people start gathering at the central square, at the Square of Republic. However, protests are located not only here, they're located in different spots around the city. People are blocking the traffic, they're blocking streets, they are showing their protest against Prime Minister Serzh Sargsyan. From day to day, there are more and more people. They are coming from different cities, smaller cities, even from abroad, from different countries, from the United States, from Europe. They come here to show their protest. They say that they feel it is their duty to come here and to support protests. Majority of protesters are young people. Some of them believe that peaceful methods will lead to the victory, but some of them also say that more radical steps are needed. However, almost all the people who gather here in the central square of Yerevan say that they are dissatisfied with the policy of the current Prime Minister and the current government. Tens of thousands of protesters have taken to the streets of Yerevan, the capital of Armenia. They are calling for the dismissal of Prime Minister and also former President Serzh Sargsyan, appointed by the Armenian parliament on April 17. According to the new law initiated by Sargsyan himself, the majority of the power is now transformed to the Prime Minister, leaving the presidency as more of the ceremonial role. The protests are led by oppositionists and leader of the civil contract party Nikol Pashinyan, but civil activists also play a big role. They organize regular meetings. One of the protest leaders, David Sanasaryan, is confident the rally participants will manage to reach their goal.
We are tired, but we are tired, first of all, from these guys. These guys makes us lots of problems. They are problem makers, and that's why we want to change and we want to be free, and we are free, we are independent, and we know where we are going. Republican Party says everyone that there is no other leader than Serzh Sargsyan. I can surely say and I can sign that every citizen can do more than Serzh Sargsyan.
The Armenian government did not react to the rallies for a long time. That is until April 21st, when the Prime Minister issued an official statement in response to the events. He is calling for a dialogue with opposition leader Nikol Pashinyan. Otherwise, there might be consequences, he hints, including a forceful dispersal of the protests. As of April 20, according to local media, the police has detained 233 people. Some had paid a small fine, but none were arrested.
It's hard to say what will happen next and how the protests will evolve, but now we can say for sure people here really want changes and they really want to see Armenia changing. Ostap Yarysh, Alexander Kochan from Yerevan for Hromadske TV.
So we've followed the updates and we'll keep our audience informed on our Facebook and Twitter. But having you here, can you also explain us to how extent this protest is representative? You know, I understand you are both civil society activists, and it's pretty common that, you know, the people who travel, who speak outside, they are this part of the, let's say, part of the society which support the changes and kind of stand up maybe against some authoritarian tendencies. So really, to what extent anybody who can start these protests are special, and whom do they represent?
Thank you, Natalia, for hosting us today. I have to say that the protests are representative. Different communities, social groups and layers of the society are on the streets at the moment in Yerevan. And I would say even those who are not on the streets, the protesters are representing their will, because in general, Armenian people are tired of this current regime. The last statistics shows that 94% of people is fed up with the regime. About 10% of people believes in the fair and free elections. And generally, there is a unrest all over the country. Villages, cities are joining as well. So I would say this is a very representative protest.
And Nvard, why would you say that it's not just the, let's say, Yerevan liberal crowd who is coming to the street?
Because we have seen the tendencies that different cities and villages are joining the protest, and they are mobilizing themselves in their cities and towns and doing their own protests. So we have seen in the beginning of the protest that Gyumri and Vanadzor, two other biggest cities of Armenia, have joined the protest, and now it has widespread all over the country. There are like international roads closed now currently in the country, and there's like civil disobedience rising day by day, hour by hour, and minute by minute. And also people from different groups, from different social classes are joining the protest. This is like something we haven't seen in Armenia for the past like 25 years.
This is a very inclusive protest. This is very important to mention, as we are seeing people with disabilities on the streets, which is not the case, which was not the case previously. We see people representing different communities, ethnic groups. So I would say, well, the entire society is protesting at the moment.
If you would speak about the president and the government, it's so much about Serzh Sargsyan currently Prime Minister, but really who is also his forces? You know, Sargsyan had been in power for 13 years as a leader of the state. He'll been in different in the government, like Minister of Defense and Minister of Interior, since mid-90s. But really, how strong is the government?
So it's being led by like Republican Party, and the head of the Republican Party is Serzh Sargsyan, and they have managed to their years of like leading the country, they have managed to occupy all possible institutions in Armenia. So, for example, the schools are led by Republican directors, all administrative buildings belong to them, even like the judicial system is not free. So, like the judges in Armenia are being appointed directly by Serzh Sargsyan. So, they have managed to spread their like authority towards all institutions, administrative institutions in Armenia. That's their support. And currently, their like supporters are those who are even beating the peaceful protesters in the street. So it's not only the police, and not the police with a civic wearing beating people, but also their protesters. So we have seen like one of the MPs from Republican Party, Samvel Alexanian, with his crew beating some protesters, and we have seen ex-MP from Republican Party also beating the protesters. So they are really afraid that they are losing something. That's why they are reacting in very dangerous way.
At the same time, how would you put it to the context? Because especially for our international audience, who know how could be the strong regimes in some of the Caucasian countries, in the Caucasus, or in the post-Soviet countries, or is it like there is an opposition?
Well, this is...
And as well, that would be my question to say that who are the people and to which extent the political opposition? We know that these protests are run by the society rather than political parties. But still, can you explain this disposition?
To connect this also to your previous question, I would say that this is not a protest against Serzh Sargsyan only. This is a protest against the entire system that he has been creating and maintaining for the last 10 years. This is against his consolidated power, and this is also against a one-party system that we are having now in Armenia. I would say that the protests are led by different people, so there is no one central power or opposition party who is organizing the protests. Protests are massive, chaotic, they take place all over the country. Obviously, there are also oppositional leaders like Nikol Pashinyan, who is behind also of this movement. And unfortunately, today we learned that he is detained with other MPs. So basically, what the government is trying to do now is to detain all the voices of freedom in the country. There are 300 people detained, mostly the leaders of civic movements and the leaders of the opposition party.
At the same time, I should say, in this part of the world, we are experience of the mass protests and this kind of a confrontation of the government. And usual answer would be to whom I should speak. You know that, okay, I wouldn't speak to the streets because they represent nobody, there is a parliament. So really, is it any tangible political force which could somehow would be the ones that the current government would relate and would see that, okay, if you ask us to step down, these are the people who would come in a legal way? Because anyways, there should be some parliament procedure. If there is a call for elections, they should be run by some legislatory bodies.
Actually, there is no that kind of agenda currently being discussed by the society. And also, like the agenda that was presented by Nikol Pashinyan was that Serzh Sargsyan resigns. There should be like new government, like temporary government, who will do some sort of functional work, and there will be changes in electoral code, and new elections will be held in the country. So this was the agenda. But I don't know at what extent to answer to this question, because it's not... Like, it's both political movement and not at the same time. Because, like, yes, there is like political resistance. We want to change the power. We want to change the authorities. But on the other hand, this is like much more civic movement rather than political movement.
And to what extent that was a surprise that the president will become the prime minister? So meaning that would be this game, actually the power game, just to go to a different position.
Of course, this wasn't any of surprise to anyone in this world, I guess. The current prime minister, so-called prime minister, self-proclaimed prime minister, has started this process back in 2014, the process of constitutional reforms. And then he publicly declared that in case the parliamentary system would be adopted by Armenia, then he would not become the prime minister. So obviously he was lying. Then he started this process, and then there was a referendum that was held with massive fraud, massive briberies, as well as using administrative resources. And of course, the constitutional reforms happened in 2015. That was followed by parliamentary elections, where again, electoral fraud was everywhere, and these elections were also falsified. So now, this logic, was completed by him becoming the prime minister. He started the process, he went through this process all the way, and now, he has the success.
The people would like to change the government, but what exactly they would like to change? We know that usually people stand up for a lot of social issues, but what exactly are on the stake in Armenia?
I think it's like the reforms in educational system, because there are lots of students and children, pupils protesting currently in the street, and access to justice and free trials, and also like it's freedom of expression. It's like much more connected with human rights and creating an atmosphere where everybody can enjoy their human rights.
When we're looking at the protests, we would keep our eye on that. We've seen that many people were arrested. We're speaking about hundreds of people arrested. Some of the MPs, despite the fact that they have some impunity on that, some people went to hospital, though I should say that there is a use of the gas. But in that regard, what are your concerns in terms of the brutality of the police? How the law enforcement is acting? Also, which I understand that Sargsyan used to be in 90s, the Minister of Interior, the Minister of Defense, so he's really from that gang, let's say.
Obviously, the law enforcement bodies are completely incapable of protecting the citizens, and it is obvious for the citizens that they are there to protect the regime. They basically belong to Mr. Sargsyan and his Republican Party, and they are bluntly and blindly following all the requests. If there is a request to, stun grenade people, then they would do it. If there is a request to imprison MPs, as they did it today, they do it. So we don't have any, I would say, hope for the police joining the protesters in any possible way.
Nvard, maybe you would give also the context for, as I already mentioned, international audience who probably somehow might not understand what makes Armenia, different from other states. As what I know, it's still, though it is an authoritarian country, there is a very vibrant civil society. It's not exactly the brutal dictatorship. So really, in this regard, what do you really expect on the future protests, how they would be? Because in some countries we exactly know that would be just, if there is a protest, people are, arrested at the same time and everything stops.
Taking into consideration the fact that we have seen that kind of scenarios quite a lot in our lives in Armenia, that the protesters are being shut down by the police, and a lot of people are being arrested, and we have the political prisoners currently in Armenia. This is a scenario. However, what I really like about these protests, that they are like peaceful protests, and everybody claims it, that this is peaceful disobedience. And the reaction from law enforcement should be comparable with what is going on. But it's not like they're overusing their authority. Because what is currently worrying me is the announcement of spokesperson of the police, that he announced that there are also policemen with civic wearings, they do not differ from the citizens, and they have the right to arrest people. And this means that everybody can arrest everyone.
That's the impunity that we are facing in Armenia.
And another question on the oligarchs and the big business. A lot depends on which card they are playing at the moment. Usually, the big business supports the government, but there is sometimes a moment when it's not so unanimous. So, what do you expect? And also, maybe you would explain how are the mainstream media covering the protest? What the people living in the villages see on their TV screens?
I'll take it on media, you can take it...
on oligarchs.
Well, I would say that in Armenia, unfortunately, the main source of the information still remains the TV. And there is no independent TV station or whatsoever in Armenia. All of them belong to political parties. So there is no chance that the mainstream media covers adequately the protests. The public TV or public radio completely manipulate the situation. They don't give the right and correct information. However, we have also an independent online media, which is working selflessly these days to cover all the events. You can follow the events live all the time, and that's the only possibility for our citizens and also the world to see what really happens in Armenia, because we cannot rely any longer on the Armenian media.
Right, on business.
So, most of the businessmen, the oligarchs, are the MPs from the Republican Party. So they are running for becoming an MP to have this status of impunity, not to get arrested, and to run their businesses more freely. And they're adopting the laws that will enhance the prosperity of their businesses. That's why Serzh Sargsyan has the support of a lot of businessmen. Though he didn't manage to evacuate the business in IT, because we have seen yesterday that a lot of people from IT sphere, IT businesses, they joined the protests.
I would like also to listen to the comment we have from John Herbst, the director of the Atlantic Council Eurasia Center, on a Western perspective on what's going on in Armenia and also in Western world.
I think these protests are a sign of life in Armenian political society. Unfortunately, Yerevan has been ruled by authoritarians for many years. And Ukrainians who are interested in democracy, who are interested in an open society, are very tired of this type of leadership. And you've had elections not too long ago, which were by no means free and fair. So this reflects the frustration of people who want to live in an open, democratic society. Whether or not they'll succeed, I'm not in a position to judge. But I do believe they point to the fact that the current/new leadership must either substantially adjust its style of rule or will find itself in a different place than in leadership.
What do you expect what do Armenians expect from the West?
Well, there are high expectations, I would say, because these days what we have been seeing also, there was a lack of solidarity and a reaction from international community. So we can maybe use this chance as an appeal to the international community to take a stance, to address the institutions, the international organizations, international media, to cover these events. Because what we have seen from our recent history, when the international community is not reacting, then the police and the local government can do everything. So we really ask our colleagues, partner organizations, international media to cover those events and to also be solidar with the fight the Armenian people are having for democracy and for their better future.
Yeah, and can I add something? I really would like to urge the international human rights organizations, especially those who have been involved in training of the police, the law enforcement in Armenia, to keep their eye on what's going on and to ensure that they go to negotiations with the law enforcement agencies and to prevent any sort of brutality and use of force against peaceful protesters.
And what is the role of Russia? You know, it's maybe not that obvious, but in our part of the world, it's also, you know, there is a clear view on what the Kremlin, how the Kremlin sees any popular uprising. Do you mention what do the Russian media, what are the quotes? You have a lot of Armenians in Russia living.
In a way, the Russian media is now kind of busy with Syria and Skripal case. So luckily and fortunately, there was not much attention, because what we have seen in previous years, whenever Russian media comes in, well, they start looking for Euromaidan everywhere. This is like a schizophrenia, you know, of Russian media. So, of course, there have been some publications already. And of course, the Russian media cannot be pro-protesters, because the current Armenian regime is backed up by Mr. Vladimir Putin. And for him, the worst-case scenario is that the Prime Minister resigns, where there have been so many promises already and commitments done to the Eurasian Economic Union and all other disintegrational units. So I think it's not of Russia's interest in any way to kind of support the current developments.
And my final, so what is the role of the Armenian diaspora? Which is one of the, you know, most known as a diasporas globally.
And like answering that question, these protests are like quite different, because Armenian diaspora has mobilized everywhere they are. Because we can see that there are huge protests even like in front of Armenian embassies all over the world. And also like currently Armenians are looking to diaspora, and they're inviting like prominent diasporan Armenians to come to Armenia to join the movement. And we invited Serzh Sargsyan, who the like solo of System of a Down, and he made like pro-protesters comments and announcements. And also like during one of the days in Republic Square during the protest, Arsine Khanjan made a statement via Skype, and there are lots of diaspora and prominent Armenians who are actually next to protesters and supporting our movement.
I have to add on this that in 2 days, Armenians all over the world would be commemorating the 103rd anniversary of the Armenian genocide. And this is the time of the year when hundreds and thousands of people are taking to the streets to commemorate the events. And we find it important that Armenian people this year turn this commemoration into a rebirth of the nation. So I think the 24th of April would be the day when we can create new Armenia that everybody wants to live in.
Oh, thanks a lot for such a detailed analysis. That was with us Nvard Margaryan, who is the president of the Pink NGO, and Grigor Yeritsyan, who is the executive director of the NGO Armenian Progressive Youth. And we'll follow the story. The full version of all our reports and interviews find on our webpage. Also sign up for our brand new newsletter if you would like to receive Hromadske International weekly highlights. The sign up box is on the upper right hand side of the site, en.hromadske.ua. As well, follow us on Twitter and Facebook, search Hromadske International. We are there 24/7, and I'll be back in a second. Sanctions, diplomatic expulsion and airstrikes in Syria over the past few months, the relationship between the United States and Russia has become increasingly fragile. Meanwhile, Washington is set to provide Javelin anti-attack missiles and some of $200 million of the US dollar in military and technical aid to Ukraine in 2018 to assist the country in its battle and protection from Russian-backed forces in Donbass. My colleague Natalie Vichro sat down with the director of the Atlantic Council Eurasia Center and former US ambassador to Ukraine, John Herbst, to discuss where the US-Russia relationship is heading and how Washington was helping Kyiv fight the Moscow-led conflict in the Donbass.
In the last few months, it seems that tensions between the West and Russia have been rising. We've had the nerve agent attack on ex-Russian spy Sergei Skripal and his daughter Yulia in the UK, and then there was a suspected chemical weapons attack by the Syrian government. I think it was a week ago, and obviously the US responded with that with airstrikes along with its allies France and the UK. So how would you describe the US-Russia relations right now, and how much tension is there really?
Well, I would say that the Kremlin has been pursuing a policy hostile to the United States, to the West, for over a decade. And you just referred to the incidents in Britain where the Russians used chemical weapons to poison a resident of Great Britain. You refer to the Assad use of chemical weapons against his own citizens, which was defended by Moscow. They have conducted aggression in Syria. They are conducting a war, a hybrid war against Ukraine and Donbass. They are supplying arms to the Taliban against the United States and its allies in Afghanistan. And the United States is finally starting to push back against these truly provocative and dangerous Kremlin policies.
Mm-hmm. And Moscow warned that a US military intervention in Syria would lead to consequences. But other than some critical words so far, the response has been pretty mute. Is the US still expecting some kind of response from Russia? And if so, what kind of response is the US
Well,
expecting?
I would not rule out a response. The United States military is much more powerful, much more capable than the Russian military. So Moscow can threaten, but if they try to use their military against ours, conventional military, they would lose decisively. Russian mercenaries, although Russian mercenaries are closely tied to the Russian government, attacked American allies and American advisors in Syria. Our forces responded, and there were reports of hundreds of Russian dead soldiers, mercenaries. I don't know if those reports are accurate, but certainly there were probably hundreds of casualties because our forces are far more capable.
French President Emmanuel Macron is coming to DC on Monday. What can we expect from that visit, and are Russia and Ukraine on the agenda?
Well, one, I think that President Trump and President Macron have established a very good working relationship, a congenial relationship. I would expect that to continue. We've seen within the last couple of weeks French and American cooperation, also with other allies in Europe, in response to the Skripal poisoning in the UK, in response to Assad's use of chemical weapons against his own people. And I believe that the cooperation between Paris and Washington that we've seen in those two instances will be reaffirmed during the Macron visit. I fully expect that, therefore, relations with an aggressive Kremlin will be on the agenda, and the need to help Ukraine, to support Ukraine against Russia's war in Donbass will also be on the agenda.
Trump's administration placed sanctions on 7 oligarchs with close ties to President Vladimir Putin, including the president's son-in-law. You've actually praised those sanctions and said they're actually pretty tough, especially in comparison to the previous list of sanctions that the US put out. Can we expect anything further in terms of sanctions against Russia? And what can we expect?
I think it depends in the first instance on Kremlin policy. If they continue their aggression in Ukraine, if they continue to support the Taliban against the United States and Afghanistan, if they continue to support the use of chemical weapons by Assad in Syria, if they use in the future chemical weapons to poison people around the world, if they continue to fly provocatively close to NATO planes and ships in Europe and elsewhere, additional sanctions are likely over one or more of those policies, those very nasty and dangerous Kremlin policies.
the US Congress has approved, I think it was $200 million in terms of for military assistance to Ukraine, which I think was set to include lethal weapons and intelligence support. Mm-hmm. Is that money definite, and can you tell us more about what will be provided in that assistance?
I believe some of the money mentioned by Congress is definite. Others is contingent upon reform by Ukraine in the defense sector. I hesitate to talk about what may be provided in the future. I think the Ukrainian government needs to make up its mind about what it wants, and then to offer its ideas to the U.S. government and reach an agreement.
On the subject of reforms, actually, there's been a lot of exasperation from the European Union and from international organizations with regard to Ukraine's reform progress. The failure to so far adopt the law on the anti-corruption court and to raise gas prices to the market rate has affected its IMF tranches. Ukraine has said that it expects an IMF tranche of some $2 billion to come in June, but today I think there's been reports of IMF saying that the progress, Ukraine's reform progress has been slow. So what is your take on that? What can Ukraine expect of this tranche, and is it likely to get it?
The quick answer to your question is that without movement to the market gas price, the higher price, without addressing the concerns of the IMF and others in the West on NABU and the anti-corruption court, you're not going to see that tranche. So the government have been reluctant to address these issues, and as long as it remains reluctant, I don't think you'll see that assistance.
Ukraine and the Balkans have more in common than meets the eye. Though the Russian-Ukrainian war in the Donbas is very different from the ethnic conflicts in former Yugoslavia in 1990s, but we can look at the role that civil society plays in time of the war, as well during the transition from authoritarian to democratic state, which aspires to join the European Union. We talked to Ivan Vejvoda, who is currently a director of Europe's Future Project at the Institute for Human Science in Vienna. Before that, he was a senior vice president of programs at the German Marshall Fund of the United States. He was famous for his role in democratic opposition in Serbia, and later in mid-2000s was an advisor on foreign policy and European integration to Serbian Prime Minister Zoran Đinđić. Vejvoda also spoke to us about the Kremlin influence on the Balkans. With your experience in the Balkans and in Serbia, you know, the civil society played a huge constructive role in overcoming the Milosevic regime, but still always the emotions are on the rise. There is a, let's say, legitimate grievance and legitimate emotions because of the war and conflict. So how it happened and what effort it had taken kind of come back to the more moderate mode after the conflict. Yeah. That's very relevant for Ukraine, I think.
Yeah. Well, first of all, it must be said that overcoming the Milosevic regime took a combined effort of oppositional politicians, of civil society, and I would say of progressive media, who were the voice of those progressive tendencies. The fact that we then came into a mode of democracy, and every beginning is difficult. We called all these societies young democracies, where institutions began to be consolidated, where the habits of using the rule of law and rights and Freedom of Information Acts, there had to be a learning process, and that took time for the voice of the people to really be heard, but it also required politicians to be sensitive to what people needed. And again, like in what we're seeing in Western societies, in these societies, politicians realized that it was not enough just to be elected and then to rule for 4 years and not to listen to the people. There's more sensitivity, and civil society has learned to push and pressure more than they did. It is not always easy because of the general socio-economic situation, where people are not living so well. But then we also have the remains or the strong emotions of nationalist groups, of civil society that we do not always agree with. And those are the people who believe that maybe this European direction is not the right one. They sometimes turn towards Russia and look at return of more social conservative ideas and do not appreciate some of these more progressive. So, in short, it's a daily struggle. Democracy is a daily issue. Democracy is a very fragile plant, and we need to nurture that plant every day, and not to just because we have elections that are free, that it's taken for granted.
And also, I would ask you, as somebody with this life, when you've been to the opposition of the, authoritarian regime in Serbia, and later you joined the government and you've been advising the democratic Prime Minister Zoran Đinđić. But also, and we have some kind of people with that kind of story in Ukraine and in this part of the world. But later, why this kind of the former opposition leaders are coming to the government? What are the things you would warn? What are mistakes you think you've done to some extent? Because, and also, how would you assess to what extent there was a backslash, then some of the revenge in Serbia when the democratic ideas have become not popular and other parties had won? So, what do you think you've done differently, and what would be your warning?
Well, first of all, I think it's important that there is this movement of people from civil society to politics, and in our society back from politics to civil society or other walks of life. We are societies that have come out of a very long period of communism, which means an authoritarian society where politics was the monopoly of one ideology and where people were atomized. The Communist Party kept people not working with each other. So to learn to have the freedom of assembly, to have the freedom of speech, to have rights takes time. And that is what we all worked in these societies. I think the warning is that when you come into politics, you then really realize how difficult it is to be juggling 20 balls at one time, and some balls will fall to the floor, and you will not be able to implement all the valid ideas that one had while was in civil society, seeing the difficulties. So realism, I think, is an important thing, which doesn't mean to abandon neither the values nor the ideals that we have, but realize that it takes time. And that is always difficult when people are not living well, that times for reform are difficult and that they require perseverance and commitment without faltering.
Would you give some examples maybe in the Balkans as well? Because you work both through the Western institution and the think tanks, but as well you probably know the region and also talk to a lot of these kind of things which happening, I think, all over. It is a bit, I guess it's a relevant experience.
Yes, indeed. We all, meaning both societies and governments whom we have elected, have committed themselves and want to join the European Union in this case. But what does that mean? That simply means we want to become good, better, more just and more democratic societies. And then the membership in the Union is simply a confirmation that we have become countries where the rule of law and justice prevails. There's no other work than getting up every day and continuing to pressure governments to change in the direction of having more democracy, of having greater media freedom, of having more independent judiciary, more independent prosecution. There's no way around, there's no magic wand which will change this. There's no voice from Brussels or Washington or forever or wherever it comes from that can change this. We do need the help. We don't, in my society, which is much smaller than yours, there's no real economic wealth, so we need investments, we need people who do development aid from European Union in particular to come and help build that substructure on which we would have a democracy. So this cannot be done alone, even though I say most of the work is on our part. We need a little help from our friends, as the word goes, to be able to move forward. And it's only in that perseverance, in that insistence to make our elected officials do what they promised us in elections that this will happen. It's not enough to vote a government that we believe will change and then go home and do our thing. It needs to be an insistent and persistent activity.
Meotida National Park, located in the war-torn Donbas region, is a unique nature complex for Ukraine and a national treasure. But its nature is not the only exceptional thing about Meotida today. Since the start of the war in the Donbas in 2014, half of the area near currently occupied Novozovsk ended up in the territory not controlled by the Ukrainian state. The other half, near Mariupol, is officially part of Ukraine's military action zone. Hromadske traveled to Meotida to find out why it's important to protect nature in a place where it's difficult to protect the peace.
Meotida National Park is unique, not only because it is home to over 50 species of rare birds, but because it is divided by the demarcation line. Of the 20,000 hectares in 2014, after the occupation of Novozovsk, half ended up in territory not controlled by the Ukrainian government.
Winter bird counts can be even worse, but at least they are carried out at a specific time, no matter the weather.
Alexander Bronskov has worked at Meotida since it opened as a national park. He heads the scientific department, but birds are his real passion. Once a week, he observes which birds are nesting or migrating through the national park. He worries about Meotida's fate, which the war has divided.
This is the most famous Laridae family bird colony in Kriva Kosa pit among ornithologists. There, on the other side, there are also some good interest in steppes. They have always been there. They created some organization there that is guarded. Some of our employees work there, and we're very grateful to them that they, despite all these events, make effort to preserve this.
After the invasion, Meotida's administration ended up in the occupied area, in Kriva Kosa. The team only had time to gather a small part of their extensive archives and other important documents. In 2015, militants shot a video clip at Meotida about their so-called Novorossiya Sea Fleet.
At least the poaching has stopped a little bit. And those fishermen who used to go fishing in Kriva Kosa, directly in the areas where the bird colonies inhabit, are no longer allowed there. Thanks to that, at least one pair of Dalmatian pelicans managed to breed this year. The 2 years before this, they didn't nest because they were too scared.
The park currently has 30 employees in total. They get around the park using their own vehicles, and they also have to pay for the petrol out of their own pockets. Their office is located near the Azov battalion base in an abandoned clinic in the village of Urdzuf. Together with volunteers, they gather furniture and brought in old computers from home. They're neighboured by the Azov battalion and the border guards.
Pretty much all of the border checkpoints are located in our territory. Of course, it's bad when in that certain period before a leadership change, and when the new leader arrives, we have to go to them and explain who we are, what we are doing, and explain that it's not us who have come to them, but they are the ones on our territory.
The director says in the 3 years of military action, the park's employees have been inspected twice. They were checking for separatists and called people in for questioning. Meotida scientists still cannot obtain the land management project. It would serve as an official proof of the fact that the territory is a nature reserve. Now they're planning to hand these lands of rare plants and birds over to the military.
We want our defenders to have land, but we don't think this should be done at the expense of nature, where there are valuable natural complexes. Firstly, it would destroy these nature complexes. Secondly, in 2 or 3 years' time, the park's land would stop providing life.
The park's scientists have appealed to the local councils, regional administrations and the Ministry of Ecology numerous times. But the response is always the same. There is no time for ecology during war.
If we give up on nature now, if we don't take care of it, then there will be nothing left when the war is over. There will simply be nowhere to live.
Thank you from the entire team of Hromadske International for watching. We are here to explain Ukraine and Eastern Europe for you. And go to our webpage en.hromadske.ua where you find full version of our interviews and reports. Don't forget to sign up for our brand new newsletter. As well, follow us on Twitter and Facebook. We are there for you 24/7. So with that, I say you goodbye.